Post the weekend, I wanted to go over a couple of things that were a few takeaways for me, a couple of things to remember, particularly as I'm learning things, just getting into adventure riding. I thought, I'll just try and express some of those things so for other people doing the same learning, hopefully they can take stuff away from it. So probably the first thing I want to touch on is damage. So damage is one of those things you are going to encounter with adventure riding, which is probably similar to motorsport. It's one of those things that people don't think about. Shit will happen. Things will go wrong and and that doesn't mean they're bad. It just means that that's a part of adventure riding. Factor in that you're going to have damage. Potentially even write something off. Now, with adventure riding, it's less likely to write something off, but it is very likely that you're going to have damage. So you've got to factor that in. So if you spend all your budget on the bike and you've got nothing left, then you're going to have issues when it comes to fixing stuff. Second part of that, of course, is that you should be able to fix stuff yourself as much as possible. And the more you can fix yourself, the easier it'll be out on the trails when you have to fix things. Now, what did we break? Probably the main one here was the windscreen. So the windscreen itself is completely intact. It didn't break, but it sheared off these bolts across the front here. Now, that's done on purpose, right? So what happened was the bike came up and hit me in the face. And so, of course, the helmet pushed this forward and it snapped the heads off the bolts, which is what we want to happen, because what we don't want to happen is that the windscreen stays where it is and causes me injury. So instead, it breaks and it moves forward. Now, luckily, actually for the day, because the wind is pushing against it, it didn't really have any issues. So since then, of course, taking the windscreen off, and I've now got this issue with the heads of the screws came off, but of course the rest of them are still embedded inside there. But these are rubber, right? So they actually shouldn't be too hard to get those out. Long nose pliers, and we'll unscrew those, get those out. And I've got some replacements already from Bunnings, ready to replace those. Now, of course, when you're replacing anything, any screws and so on, just be mindful that you're not replacing it with something that is potentially stronger than what it's intended to be. So as I said before, it's meant to break so that it doesn't hurt me. So if I replace those with high tensile bolts, and then they won't break, and then that will injure me instead. So having said that, for this one, these are rubber where it goes into, so it's meant to pull out. So instead it would pull out of these the screw would pull out anyway, even if it was high tensile. So that is just something to consider if you're replacing something, is make sure you're replacing it with the right bit. Stronger doesn't mean better. Okay, the only other thing really, apart from little bits and pieces like this is one of the reasons why I bought a cheaper bike, by the way, because it was already damaged. So things like this were already there, which meant that I didn't have to worry about it. The only other thing was the brake lever. It bent itself up that way. Obviously it landed down on its side. The crash bar did protect it somewhat. You can see the brake lever's kind of at this area, but of course it hit pretty hard downwards that way, so it did bend this up a bit. But we'll just take that off and heat it up a little bit and bend it back around. But it hasn't got too far, it has to move. So it's just still completely usable, just slightly, not where it should be. So we'll fix that up. This is sort of the advantage of being an older bike, is that you can just bend these things back and so on. This is made of mild steel. So whereas, modern bikes tend to have some fancy stuff in there with adjusters and stuff like that. So you kind of probably have to replace it instead, whereas we can probably get away with just bending this back. The best opportunity to do all this checkover when you get the bike back is when you wash it. So as you're washing it down, if you wash it when you first get back, and even if it's just a quick rinse, it's your opportunity to scan over everything and just make sure nothing's broken. So we've damaged the brake lever, but we need to check to make sure that the master cylinder for the brake is still intact and there's no issues there. And clearly, I can see that there's no leaks. It's fairly well protected behind here, so it's actually quite a nice setup. So and there's no issues there. Still got plenty of pressure. So it's now a week or so past when we returned, and there's nothing on the floor. There's no leakage or anything from the brakes. So we know that that's pretty much intact. Pretty unusual to damage, main brake lines and stuff like that, but it is possible. So it's always good to check those things. And then while we're down here, just scanning over for any other potential damage, anything else that's broken, but we're looking pretty good.
So what are we going to do, Vern? Adventure time?
Well, have you got a device that measures the water? No.
The other thing I wanted to touch on before we head back inside is these bags. Now, I bought these bags on Amazon. They are the cheapest saddlebags you can possibly buy. And I know what a lot of people might be thinking is, you can't really be an adventure rider if you're just buying the cheapest shit there is. And it's like, yes, I agree with that to a point. However, my approach has always been buy the cheapest thing first, figure out whether it works for you. Otherwise, you could potentially waste your money on buying something that you actually don't use. Whereas if you can buy yourself an MVP, what is the minimum viable product that I can get to be a proof of concept and make sure that that's the right setup that suits me. And these were the perfect example. So these are like $170, I think, on Amazon. You compare that to, if you had a GS 1200 and bought the panniers and so on, you might set you back about $3,000. This bike didn't even cost that much. So it would be pointless for me to spend that much money on those bags. Now, what I have found though with these bags is they're fantastic. They're actually brilliant. Yes, I would like probably some compartments in there, but I just put bags inside the bags, right? And it keeps everything compartmentalized inside the bag. But these are brilliant. They hold as much as I'd ever want to hold. Last weekend we packed tents, mattress, little blow-up pillows. They're all sort of hiking setup, and a sleeping bag, clothes, spare parts, and all that sort of stuff. Everything I needed, including all the GoPro gear and everything else. And it all fitted in these bags very, very comfortably. Everything stayed perfectly dry. Even with the river crossings and all the rain that we had, everything stayed perfectly dry. Nothing, no water at all got into these bags. They were perfectly secure the whole time. And I had absolutely no issues with them. So yes, they may be the cheapest bags there are to buy, but if it does the job, then what's the problem? They're reasonably tough. They're waterproof. It literally mounts up perfectly onto the bike. There's no problem. Like, honestly, yes, the panniers will be slightly easier, but I don't want panniers because I don't want a hard box on the side of the bike. And there's plenty of reasons why hard boxes don't work too well when you're off-road. So these have worked really, really well. I'd highly recommend it. They're the Wild Heart ones. Matt bought the one that sits on top, the bag, and by all reports, that's also just as good. So if you really wanted something, if you wanted to buy the whole package, then you could get these plus the on-top bag, and you never need any more storage than that. So yeah, highly recommend these, really good. The other advantage of them being really cheap is that if something happens to them and they tear or break or whatever,
You got a dirty ass.
then I can probably buy 10 of these for the same price as the expensive one, and get 10 years out of it. Even if I get only a year out of each one, I've probably still spent less money. So that's something else to factor in as well. So Matt's got a couple of repairs on his as well. I think Gary's also replaced chains and stuff like that. So whenever you run through water and so on, it's a good idea to make sure that the water hasn't got into stuff. Lubing chains and cleaning chains, all that sort of stuff. So that's the other things just to factor in. Having a nice little maintenance schedule to do post-ride, pre-ride, and so on, and on a regular basis is a good idea too. Probably one last point I want to make is that with this ride that we went on, we obviously encountered a lot of changes. So I had a reasonably laid out plan, and it was down tracks mostly that I'd been down before. So it was a good plan. But of course we encountered blocked roads and so on a number of occasions. So on Brush Creek Road, as they've had a landslip, so that's what closed that road. So you always got to have in mind a plan that is flexible. I like to plan to a point where I really sort of plot out, exact path we're going to take, where we're going to end up and when we're going to end up there and so on. But it's really important to also have a plan that is flexible. It's really important to have backups, right? What are the alternatives? What are the alternative routes that you can take? So it's a good idea when you do a plan for a ride is you figure out your main path, but also add in a few extra variables, a few extra options, and have those up your sleeve just in case. So you've got to have that plan as your foundation, and then you can sort of figure out all your alternatives. But without that base plan, you're kind of just making it up as you go along. Know where your fuel stops are. And so if you have to do an extra route around and you add an extra 50 Ks, then you've got to factor that in, and know who has got the smallest tank. Within the rides, we always factor in, whichever bike has the smallest tank, the least number of Ks to empty. I always base the plans around that. So I tend to plot out in Excel, exactly each of the stops that we're going on, and then which ones we fuel up at. And so then I know the maximum range that we're going to need. And then obviously when I see that there's a gap that's too wide for the smallest bike to make, then we factor in another fuel stop. And buffering in, of course, the possibilities you're going to have to backtrack, because that's always a factor. Like we did with Brush Creek, we ended up at the end of the road, had to do a U-turn, go back again and loop back around. So we filled up in a different spot than what I was planning to. So, but that's the whole idea. That's the whole point, is to make sure you have a plan that is good, but also flexible. So there's a couple of rides that we're looking at the moment. A friend of mine, Tubbsy, just bought a GS, so we're looking at, hey Tubbsy, so we're looking at doing a run down Barry Way, which I actually have been down when I was about 15. My dad decided to take a detour from the ski fields, and bad day of, snow was bad, so we thought we'd do a bit of a detour on the way back home. So we went down the Barry Way, and I just remember as a 15-year-old just being blown away by how stunning it was. And it was pretty full on back then. I don't know if it's still the same. It's probably a lot better condition now than what it was back then. But yes, I'm looking forward to going back there and checking that out. And then we've got a planned route with the usuals to basically do a big loop around Wombian Caves and end up at Wallandilly. So yeah, that's planned rides coming up, and looking forward to that. There's riding, and then there's just like everything in between, waiting for the next ride. All right, can't wait to get out of there. Anyway, all right, that's it. Stay safe, have fun, see you next time.